Good evening again. We'd like to continue our dinner program and have our speaker for the evening. From its inception, Hillsdale College has defended the Constitution. It was the first American college to prohibit in its charter any discrimination based on race, religion, or sex, and became an early force in the abolition of slavery. A higher percentage of Hillsdale students enlisted during the Civil War than from any other Western college. Of the more than 400 who fought for the Union, 4 won the Congressional Medal of Honor, 3 became generals, and many more served as regimental commanders. 60 of them gave their lives. The college continues to uphold the principles of the Constitution by defending its independence, refusing to count our students by race, and refusing to bring any federal taxpayer money to Hillsdale College. We teach the most important things to know, and among those are the principles of liberty. As part of its core, Hillsdale College requires each and every student to take a course on the United States Constitution. Hillsdale continues to carry its original mission today, both in its classrooms and nationwide, through its many outreach programs around the country. 16 charter schools, the Kirby Center here in Washington, D.C., its online courses, which have now been taken by over 1 million people, and of course, Imprimis, which now reaches over 3.5 million readers every month. Let me introduce to you the man responsible for leading this great institution. I've had the privilege of knowing and working with him for 25 years. We first met when he was president of the Claremont Institute in California. Originally from Arkansas, he received his MA and PhD in government from the Claremont Graduate School. He worked in England as research director for Sir Martin Gilbert, the official biographer of Sir Winston Churchill, while studying at the London School of Economics. It was there that he met his wonderful wife, Penny, who is here this evening. He was the founding chairman of the California Civil Rights Initiative, which prohibited racial preference in state hiring, contracting, and college admissions. He is now on the board of directors of the Heritage Foundation, the Henry Salvatore Center of Claremont McKenna College, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and the Claremont Institute. He is the past president of the Philadelphia Society. In 2015, he received the Bradley Prize from the Lynd and Harry Bradley Foundation. He is the author of 3 books: Liberty and Learning, The Evolution of American Education, The Founder's Key, The Divine and Natural Connection Between the Declaration and the Constitution, and What We Risk by Losing It, and most recently, Churchill's Trial, Winston Churchill and the Salvation of Free Government. In addition to being a professor of politics and history and teaching a range of courses from Aristotle to Winston Churchill, he is the 12th president of Hillsdale College, Larry Arnn.
Thank you, Matthew. Hi, welcome. I know you're all very concerned about global warming, and I don't watch the TV news, and I don't watch the Emmys, but this morning I read the news, and I discovered that they found the solution. Did you know that the red carpet last night was air-conditioned, and the red carpet is outside? I think we should just heat and cool the planet, right? Why not? Yeah, I have been working with Matthew for a long time, more than half his age. And I actually have known our speaker for about half his age. It's amazing. I want to say a word. Would the alums of Hillsdale College stand up again so I can look at you? Because I want to remember. So stay standing. Okay, so Yeah. And see, there's two things you need to notice. One of them is the older ones are dumber than the younger ones. And the other is, so Morel and Brittany and, who's that? Oh, Ray, yeah. So that little nerd right there is the general counsel in the Department of Labor under a very great, I mean, I never thought I'd say these words, a very great Secretary of Labor. And Brittany and David work in the White House and act like grown-ups, I don't know. And all of them, it's good to see you all. You know, it's awesome. I thought some of them might work out, and then they did. Do you notice there's a lot of emergencies now? I don't read the Drudge Report every day, but I do read it sometimes. And, you know, the number of emergencies, like there were like 80 emergencies last night at the Emmy Awards. I mean, Stephen Colbert himself is an emergency. But, you know, everything is very critical. For a long time, there weren't any hurricanes, and that was a sign of climate change and imminent death. And now there's a bunch of them, and that's a sign of climate change and imminent death. And the budget's out of balance, or it's not. I mean, it always is now, right? Everything is an emergency, and everything is a war. And introducing our speaker, I want to mention why that's dangerous. In 1936, Winston Churchill wrote a very great essay. He actually wrote a very great essay every year that he lived, and he died at age 90. But this one is called, "What Good's a Constitution?" And he makes a point that's everywhere in Churchill, and that is war is not good for freedom. Because when you get in a war, especially under modern conditions, you have to use everything you've got. You have to conscript everything. You have to. Victor Hansen, you know who that is, very great scholar, was on our campus the last 3 weeks, and he gave a talk. He's got a new book out coming out next month called The Second World Wars. And he talked in this talk at the beginning of it about the scale of the Second World War. And it's just the most destructive thing that ever happened. And so you want to avoid that. Churchill spent his life trying to avoid things like that, and ended up, because nobody gets to determine the course of events by himself, commanding and things like that. And then after he won his glory in the Second World War, he called it the unnecessary war. Because if they'd just done the right thing in advance, that wouldn't have happened. In 1936, Franklin Roosevelt had declared war on the Great Depression. And Churchill's essay, "What Good's a Constitution?" it's called, says that if you're going to have a liberal society, you can't be always at war. And especially, you can't treat things in domestic policy like they're the equivalent of war. Because when you get in a war, you can conscript things. And if you conscript things, then what's left of us and our private lives? You know, the federal government is making bathroom policy. You know, I'd like to say only in public institutions. It's backed off from that some lately since the election. But if that's a matter of federal concern, what room is there for us to live our lives? And you know, another thing, how would we know when there was a real emergency? I mean, I counted more than 30 in the Drudge Report this morning. Emergencies. How would you know when there was a real one? What do statesmen do? Well, you know, we think that they're either principled. We think if they're principled, they're statesmen, and if they're not, they're politicians. Those words are actually synonyms. And if you think about your own life, you'll soon discover that you don't always do the principled thing. And what the principled thing is changes every day. It depends on the circumstances, right? Is it wrong to kill? Yeah. Is it wrong to kill Hitler? Add the detail of who that guy was? It's a circumstance, but it changes everything, right? Statesmen are mostly adaptable. And Lord help us today, are they not adaptable? On the other hand, are they principled too? Are they capable of strategy? Are they capable, while they adapt every day, of pursuing some consistent line for a long time? Our speaker grew up in Arkansas. We're not cousins. It's a slander against our state to say that we are. Although it's a fact that both he and I married from outside the state, me very far outside the state, in order to diversify the gene pool. It's a shocking thing to say, but it's true that compared to him, I'm actually kind of a city boy. Because he comes from Dardanelle, which is co-capital of Yell County, Yell, Y-E-L-L. Whereas Pocahontas is 6,000 people, a good 30% larger than Dardanelle. And the sole capital. His dad was a farmer. My dad was a school teacher. See, kind of fancy pants we were. He went to Harvard. That's when I met him. You know, he was in undergraduate school, and I was already an old man. And I noticed about him right away, he's a very purposeful human being. He's fun, but he's serious. The year didn't go by. Was it 1997, I think, is maybe when I met him, so it's 20 years ago, 20 years ago. And he's 40 probably or something like that now. I don't think the year has gone by that I haven't heard from him 3 or 4 times. Always about something that matters. He grew up without any money. His sister, who's terribly like my sister, she's a graduate of the University of, I have 2 sisters actually. She's a graduate of the University of Arkansas Law School, and she told me, first time I met him at his wedding, met her, that she does his taxes and he never had any money, and that's because he's impractical. Well, he actually has had 2 jobs that paid pretty well, but he quit one of them to join the Army, and he quit the other one to run for Congress. Fiscally stupid. He asked my advice about joining the Army. I said, yeah, you need to do that. He said, most people say not. I think he mentioned Tom West, who's in the audience, who's talking tomorrow and who wrote a really great book lately that you should read. Tom West also told him he should do it. And he said, why do you think I should do it? And I said, well, you're thinking about trying to save the country and you want to do something that's real. Because everybody lies in politics, right? But risking your life, it's hard to lie about that because you might get killed. He refused to be a lawyer in the Army, the JAG, Judge Advocate General Corps, Harvard Law degree. Of course, they wanted that. He led troops in, he was a ranger. He led troops in Iraq. He served in the Old Guard. He led troops in Afghanistan, in Reconstruction and counterinsurgency. Won a Bronze Star. Comes back, runs for Congress, wins, runs for Senate pretty quick. If you come from Arkansas, as I do, the Pryor family will be known to you because they're Arkansas used to be kind of slavish when I was growing up because, you know, an old democratic state, and it's not a very big place. It's just great, very beautiful place, very, very fine place. You should go to Arkansas. Meet my cousins. Proud of itself, Arkansas is. And we liked to return guys over and over and over back to office. So we had Wilbur Mills and Fulbright, whom I met when I was in college, and thought at the time he was a great man. There's just no overestimating the ignorance of a college student. I ask all of you alums to remember that. So then the Pryor family came in. First David Pryor, governor, representative, did everything. And we sort of have an ancestral thing going on. And so Mark Pryor, who's an incredibly pleasant man and big popularity Democrat, and as geniuses in the Senate go, he's a very pleasant man. And Tom's going to run against him. And he'd already beat a former Miss Arkansas in a primary for Congress. So now I was beginning to believe in him. But I'll tell you the real reason I believe in him. What's important right now? I'll tell you three things that matter a lot. North Korea, as an agent of China, is threatening us with nuclear holocaust. That's important. Read Winston Churchill about the power of modern weapons and their ability to overcome any chance for a liberal society. Just remember, like I can tell you from my own line of work, you can't have college unless people can relax. Everything is not a public policy issue. You've got to stop and read a book. You've got to think. You've got to walk slow to class if you want to. You've got to take time over lunch. If everything is an engineering project, and if you just watch the TV news, which I seldom watch, that's all it is. It's converting every aspect of life into an engineering project. But Lord help us, nuclear war. And that crappy place, hosted probably by that's serious. All these emergencies that they talk about on the Drudge Report, that's a real one. Here's another one. In a free country, the people get to govern. So it matters what they're like. Matters whether they want to be free. Matters if they know how. Matters if they've learned the right things. I used to not care so much about immigration myself until the President of the United States, by executive order, altered the status of several million people. And I thought to myself, one of the complaints against the king of the Declaration of Independence is that he expanded the territory of Quebec, which he could control, so that he could pick who his constituents were. In other words, not the people picking the government, now the government picking the people. And then finally, a third. You see, in both of these, freedom, liberalism, living free and right as human beings, they hinge on these first two things. And the third one is exactly the same. I looked it up today. In the Congress that ended last January passed 358 laws. 2 years, right? That's about how many they passed every 2-year cycle for about 100 years. But last calendar year alone, 87,000 pages were added to the Federal Register. Where'd they come from? The answer is there's a whole new government invented in America. And it makes nearly all of our laws. And it enforces those laws too. And it adjudicates disputes that come from those laws. The whole constitutional fabric is upset because of that. I've just named to you the three things that Tom Cotton has spent the lion's share of his job doing since he got elected to Congress. You think he doesn't have a sense of strategy? I introduce to you the most promising young man, Thomas Cotton.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you so much. That is such a warm welcome. And Larry, thank you very much for the kind introduction, as always. After an introduction so splendid, even I am interested in what I will say tonight now. You know, Larry has had the occasion to introduce me on many occasions, and I'm always grateful for it because he gives such fine remarks. The only complicating factor is the height of these microphones. Fortunately, we've worked it out tonight. You know, Hillsdale studies many great statesmen. Two of the greatest would be Abraham Lincoln, who was 6'4", and Winston Churchill, who was 5'6". It's an indication that the truly great men come in all statures and something to which we can all aspire. Thank you all, Hillsdale, for having me back for my second Hillsdale Constitution Day celebration. At first, I thought this was an encore performance, but then Larry Allan told me it was more of a shot at redemption. But whatever the case may be, it is always good to see so many old friends and patriots. In a way, not much has changed since we gathered together 2 years ago. Yesterday, we celebrated the 230th anniversary of the signing of our Constitution. Earlier this year, Congress was seated for the 115th time under that charter of government. And last year, the American people once again expressed their judgment about our government through regular elections. But I think we all know a lot more has changed in the last 2 years, that something more fundamental is afoot. For the first time in all those elections, our people chose as president someone with no high government experience. Not a senator, not a congressman, not a governor, not a cabinet secretary, not a general. It's worth reflecting on why they did that. I would suggest it's because they've lost confidence in our governing class of both parties, in both its competence and its intentions. Government now takes nearly half of every dollar our workers earn and bosses us around in every aspect of life, yet can't even deliver basic services well. Our working class, the forgotten man, to use a phrase favored by Ronald Reagan and FDR, has seen its wages stagnate, while the 4 richest counties in America are all within inside the Washington Beltway. The kids of those forgotten men are the ones who chiefly fight our seemingly endless wars and police our streets, only to come in for criticism too often from the very elite who sleep under the blanket of security they provide. If you don't understand this, if last year's election came as a complete shock to you, then you truly need to spend more time outside of Washington, D.C. Donald Trump understood these things. Though I should add, he didn't cause these things. His victory was more effect than cause of our present discontents. The multiplying failures and arrogance of our governing class are what created the conditions for his victory. Immigration is probably the best example of this. President Trump deviated from Republican orthodoxy on several issues, but immigration was the defining issue in which he broke from a bipartisan conventional wisdom. For years, all Democrats and many Republicans have agreed on the outline of what's commonly called comprehensive immigration reform, which is Washington code for amnesty, mass immigration, and open borders in perpetuity. This approach was embodied most recently in the so-called Gang of Eight bill in 2013. It passed the Senate, but thankfully, we killed it in the House, which I consider among my chief accomplishments in Congress so far. Two members of the so-called Gang of Eight ran for my party's nomination for president last year. Neither won a single statewide primary. Yet Donald Trump denounced the bill, and he won the nomination. Likewise, Hillary Clinton campaigned not just for mass immigration, but also on a policy of no deportations of anyone ever who's illegally present in our country. She also accused her opponent of racism and xenophobia. Yet, Donald Trump beat her by winning states that no Republican had won since the 1980s. Clearly, immigration was an issue of signal importance in the election. And that's because it's more than just another issue. Immigration touches upon fundamental questions of citizenship, community, and identity. For too long, a bipartisan, cosmopolitan elite has minimized the concerns about these things and put their own interest above the national interest. No one captured the sensibility better than President Obama when he famously called himself a citizen of the world. With that phrase, he revealed a deep misunderstanding of citizenship. After all, citizen and city share the same Greek root word. In its classical meaning, citizenship, by definition, meant you belonged to a particular political community. Yet many of our elites share this sensibility. They believe that American citizenship, real, actual citizenship, is meaningless, ought not be foreclosed to anyone, and ought not be the basis for distinctions between citizens and foreigners. You might say they think American exceptionalism lies in not making exceptions when it comes to citizenship. This globalist mindset is, shall we say, foreign to most Americans. And it's foreign to the American political tradition. Take the Declaration of Independence. Our cosmopolitan elites love to cite its stirring passages about the rights of mankind when they talk about immigration, refugees, and so forth. They're not wrong to do so. Unlike any other country, America is an idea, but it is not only an idea. America is a real, particular place with real borders and real flesh and blood people. And the Declaration tells us it was so from the very beginning. Before those stirring passages about unalienable rights and nature's God, in the very first sentence, in fact, the founders say it has become necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands that tie them to another. One people. One people. Not all people, not citizens of the world, but one people. They're speaking of actual, particular people who made up actual colonies. And they frequently use the words we and us throughout the Declaration to describe that people. Furthermore, on 7 different occasions, the Declaration speaks of these colonies and these states. The founders were concerned about their own circumstances. They owed a duty to their own people who had sent them as representatives to the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. They weren't trying to free South America from Spanish or Portuguese dominion, much as they might have opposed that. And perhaps most notably, the founders explained toward the end of the Declaration that they had appealed not only to King George for redress, but also to their fellow British citizens. Yet those fellow citizens had been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity. Consanguinity. That's pretty much the opposite of being a citizen of the world. So while the Declaration is, of course, a universal document, it's also a particular document about one nation and one people. The founders pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to each other in English, right here in America, not in Esperanto, to mankind in the abstract. The Constitution carries forward this concept of American citizenship. It includes only one reference to immigration, where it empowers Congress to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. It's worth pondering a couple points there. First, what's that word uniform doing? The Constitution only uses the word 3 times when requiring uniform rules for naturalization, bankruptcies, and taxation. These are some of the things that could most closely knit together our union or blow it apart. Taxation by the central government, the system of credit upon which the whole free enterprise depends, and the meaning of citizenship. On these things, the founders insisted upon a single, uniform, nationwide standard. Diverse habits and laws are suitable for many things in our continental republic, but not for all things. In particular, we can only have one people, united by a common understanding of citizenship. Second, that word naturalization implies a citizenship process by which foreigners can renounce their former allegiances and become citizens of the United States. They can cast off what accident and force have thrust upon them, race, class, ethnicity, and take on, by reflection and choice, a new title, American. That is a wonderful and beautiful thing, and one of which we are all justly proud. Few Americans love our land so much as the immigrants who've escaped the yoke of tyranny. But our cosmopolitan elites take it to an extreme. They think because anyone can become an American, we are morally obligated to treat everyone like an American. If you don't, you're hard-hearted, bigoted, intolerant, xenophobic. And so the only policies that aren't inherently un-American are those that effectively erase our borders and erase the distinction between citizen and foreigner. Don't erect barriers on the border. Give sanctuary cities a pass. Spare illegal immigrants from deportation. Allow American businesses to import as much cheap labor as they want. Anything less is a betrayal of our ideals. But that's just not the case. Just because you can become an American doesn't mean you are an American. And it certainly doesn't mean that we have to treat you as an American, especially if you don't play by our rules. After all, in our unique brand of nationalism, which connects our people through our ideas, repudiating our law is kind of like renouncing your blood ties in the monarchical lands of old. And what law is more fundamental to a political community than who gets to become a citizen, under what conditions, and when? While we wish our fellow man well, we only serve our fellow citizens. It's our fellow citizens to whom we have a duty and whom our government is created to serve. And among the highest obligations we owe to each other is to ensure that every working American can lead a dignified life. If you look across our history, I'd argue that's always been the purpose of our immigration system, to create conditions in which normal, hardworking Americans can thrive. Look no further, in fact, than what James Madison said on the floor of the House of Representatives in 1790, when the first Congress was debating the very first naturalization law. He said, "It is no doubt very desirable that we should hold out as many inducements as possible for the worthy part of mankind to come and settle amongst us and throw their fortunes into a common lot with ours. The worthy part, not the entire world. Madison continued. But why is this desirable? Not merely to swell the catalog of our people, no sir. It is to increase the wealth and strength of the community. To increase the wealth and strength of the community. That's quite a statement. Quite a contrast to today's elite consensus. Our immigration system doesn't exist to serve the interest of foreigners or wealthy Americans. No, our immigration ought to benefit working Americans and serve the national interest. That's the purpose of immigration, and that's the theme of the story of American immigration. Although, when open borders enthusiasts tell that story, it sounds more like a fairy tale. The way they tell it, America at first was a land that accepted all comers without conditions. But then, periodically, the forces of nativism and bigotry would rear their ugly head and restrict who could come to the country. They triumphed for a time with the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, but eventually, these forces of darkness were defeated by the spirit of Emma Lazarus and the New Colossus poem, with the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which again opened our shores and is still the law governing our immigration system today, and everyone lived happily ever after. Well, if I were to grade that account, not even as strictly as Larry Arnn or Hillsdale professor, I would give them an F for history and an A in creative writing. Because the history of immigration in America is not one of ever-growing tides of huddled masses from the Pilgrims to today. On the contrary, throughout our history, American immigration has followed a surge and pause pattern. The first big wave was the Irish and German immigrants in the 1840s and 1850s. Then, immigration tapered off during the Civil War. The second big wave was the Central and Southern European immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This wave ended with the 1924 Act and the years of lower immigration that followed. And now, we're in the longest wave yet. The surge of immigration from Latin America and East and South Asia, which is followed from the 1965 Act. In this actual history, not the fairy tale history, the 1924 Act is not an aberration, but an ebb in the regular ebb and flow of immigration to America. After decades of unskilled mass immigration, that law responded by controlling future immigration flows. One result of lower levels of immigration was that it allowed those earlier immigrants to assimilate, learn new skills, and move up the economic ladder, creating the conditions for mass affluence in the post-war era. Now, there's no denying that the story of American immigration also has its uglier chapters. The Chinese Exclusion Act, the national origins quota system imposed by the 1924 Act, the indifference to Jews in the 1930s. We ought to remember and learn from this history. One important lesson, though, is this. If the political class had heeded the concerns of working Americans during the second wave, the 1924 Act likely would have passed earlier and been less restrictionist. The danger lies not in addressing our people's legitimate, reasonable concerns about immigration. The danger lies in our leaders ignoring those concerns and slandering the people as bigots. But then we shouldn't be surprised when politicians fail to understand fully the implications of their actions. Take the 1965 Act. That law ended the national origins quota system and at the time was minimized in its importance. In fact, when President Johnson signed it into law, he said, "The bill that we sign today is not a revolutionary bill. It does not affect the lives of millions. It will not reshape the structure of our daily lives or really add, importantly, to either our wealth or our power." How wrong he was. The economy we're living in today is in no small part a result of the 1965 Act, because it opened the door to mass immigration of unskilled and low-skilled workers, primarily through unlimited family chain migration. And that's not an economy anyone should be satisfied with. Today, we have about 1 million immigrants a year. That's like adding the population of Montana every single year, or the population of Arkansas every 3 years. But only 1 in 15 of those million-plus immigrants come here for employment-based reasons. The vast majority of them come here simply because they happen to be related to someone already here. That's why, for example, we have more Somalia-born residents than Australia-born residents, even though Australia is nearly twice the size of Somalia, and Australians are obviously better prepared, as a general matter, to integrate and assimilate into the American way of life. In sum, over 36 million immigrants, or 94% of the total, have come to America over the last 50 years for reasons having nothing to do with employment. And that's to say nothing of the over 24 million illegal immigrants who have come here as well. Put them together and you have 60 million immigrants, legal and illegal, who did not come to this country because of a job offer or because of their skills. That's like adding almost the entire population of the United Kingdom. And it also says nothing of the millions of temporary guest workers we import every year into our country. Now, unlike some open border zealots, I don't believe the law of supply and demand is magically repealed for the labor markets. That means our immigration system has been depressing wages for people who work with their hands and on their feet, for people who have to take a shower after they get off work, not before they go to work. In fact, wages for Americans with a high school degree have dropped by 2% since the late 1970s. And for those who didn't finish high school, they've dropped by a staggering 17%. And studies say, though immigration has a minimal effect overall on the wages of Americans, it has a severe negative effect on low-skilled workers, minorities, and even recent immigrants. Is automation to blame, in part? Sure. Is globalized trade partly to blame? Yes, of course. But there's no denying that a steady supply of cheap, unskilled labor has hurt working-class wages as well. Plus which, among those three factors, immigration policy is the one that we can control most easily for the benefit of the American worker. Yet we've done the opposite by allowing immigration to consistently hurt our blue-collar workers. Trust me, I know the response of open borders enthusiasts. I hear it all the time. They plead that we need a steady supply of cheap, unskilled labor because there are, quote, jobs that no American will do. But that just isn't so. There is no job Americans won't do. In fact, there's no industry in America in which the majority of workers are not natural-born Americans. Not landscapers, not construction workers, not ski instructors, not lifeguards, not resort workers, not childcare workers, not a single job that overeducated elites associate with immigrants. Because the simple fact is, if the wage is decent and the employer obeys the law, Americans will do any job. And for tough, dangerous, physically demanding jobs, maybe working folks do deserve a little bit of a raise. No American will do that job. Let me just pause for a moment and confess how much I detest that sentiment. As I've said, it's ignorant of the economic facts. Furthermore, it's insulting, condescending, and demeaning to our countrymen. Millions of Americans make our hotel beds and build our houses and clean our offices. Imagine how they feel when they hear some pampered elite say no American will do their job. And finally, I must say that sentiment also carries more than a whiff of the very prejudice of which they accuse those concerned about the effects of mass immigration. But it's not only the harmful impact on blue-collar workers. There's another problem with our current system. Because we give 2/3 of our green cards to relatives of people here, there are huge backlogs in the system which force highly talented immigrants to wait in line for years behind applicants whose only claim to naturalization is a random family connection to someone who happened to get here years ago. We therefore lose out on the very best talent coming into our country. The ultra-high-skilled immigrants who can come to America, stand on their own 2 feet, pay taxes, and through their entrepreneurial spirit and innovation create more and higher-paying jobs for our citizens. To put it simply, we have an immigration system that is badly failing Madison's test of increasing the wealth and strength of the community. It might work to the advantage of a favored few, perhaps, but not for the common good, and especially not the good of working-class Americans. And that's why I've introduced legislation to fix our naturalization system. It's called the RAISE Act, Reforming American Immigration for a Strong Economy. The RAISE Act will correct the flaws of the 1965 Act by reorienting our immigration system towards foreigners who have the most to contribute to our country. It would create a skills-based point system similar to Canada's and Australia's. Here's how it would work. When people apply to immigrate here, they'd be given an easy-to-calculate score on a scale of 0 to 100 based on their education, age, job salary, investment ability, English language skills, and any extraordinary achievements. Then, twice a year, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services would invite the top scorers to complete their applications, and it would invite enough high-scoring applicants to fill the current 140,000 annual employment-based green card slots. We'd still admit spouses and unmarried minor children of citizens and legal permanent residents, but we'd end the preferences for most extended and adult family members. No more unlimited chain migration. We'd also eliminate the so-called diversity visa lottery, which hands out green cards randomly without regard to skills or family connections, is plagued by fraud, and doesn't even promote diversity, since Europeans are the fastest growing beneficiaries. No offense, Penny. We'd remove per-country caps on immigration too, so that high-skilled applicants aren't shut out of the process simply because of their country of origin. And finally, we'd cap the number of refugees offered permanent residency to 50,000 per year, in line with the recent average for the Bush era and most of the Obama era, and still quite generous. Add it all up, and our annual immigration pool would be younger, higher skilled, and ready to contribute to our economy without using welfare, as more than half of immigrant households do today. No longer would we distribute green cards essentially based on random chance, nor would we import millions of unskilled workers to take jobs from blue-collar Americans and undercut their wages. And over a 10-year period, our annual immigration levels would decrease by half, gradually returning to historical norms. And now, given current events, this legislation is timelier than ever. Earlier this month, President Trump announced that he would wind down, over 6 months, the unconstitutional Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, also known as DACA. President Obama abused his authority with DACA, purporting to give legal status to illegal immigrants who arrived here as children and who now are in their 20s and 30s. As we've seen, the Constitution reserves to Congress the power to make uniform laws of naturalization. Even a part-time left-wing law professor would concede that the president lacks that power, And indeed, President Obama conceded it. Because of President Obama's unlawful action, about 700,000 people are now in a kind of legal limbo. President Trump did the right thing as a matter of law by ending DACA, though as a matter of policy, he'd prefer its beneficiaries don't face deportation. Democrats agree, a lot of Republicans do too. So the question isn't so much about deportation, but rather if and what kind of compromise Congress can strike. And here's where the RAISE Act comes in. We can, if we choose, grant citizenship to those illegal immigrants who came here through no fault of their own as kids and who've otherwise been law-abiding, productive citizens. But if we do, it will have the effect of legalizing through chain migration their parents, the very people who created the problem by bringing the kids here illegally. Some like to say that children shouldn't pay for the crimes of the parents, but surely parents can pay for the crimes of the parents. And that's to say nothing of their siblings and spouses, and then all the second and third order chain migration those people can create. So simply codifying DACA without ending chain migration would rapidly accelerate the wave of unskilled immigrant labor that's been depressing the wages of working Americans. An obvious compromise, then, is to pair any attempt to codify DACA with reform of the green card system to protect American workers. A standalone amnesty will not do, nor will an amnesty with vague promises of border security, which never seem to materialize or get funded once the pressure is off Congress. But if we were to codify DACA along with the reforms in the RAISE Act, we would protect working Americans from the worst consequences of President Obama's irresponsible decision. President Trump has said chain migration must be ended in any legislative compromise, and he's highlighted the RAISE Act as a good starting point for those negotiations. I support that approach, and I'm committed to working with my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans alike, on a deal that protects America's workers and citizens. But it won't be easy. Immigration has emerged in recent years as a kind of acid test for our leaders, a test they've mostly failed. Our cosmopolitan elite in both parties has pursued a radical immigration policy that's inconsistent with our history and our political traditions. They've celebrated the American idea, yet undermine the actual American people of the here and now. They've forgotten that the Declaration speaks of one people and the Constitution of we, the people. At the same time, they've enriched themselves and improved their quality of life while creating a new class of forgotten men. It's not surprising, then, that the people rebelled last year. There's probably no issue that calls more for an America First approach than immigration. After all, the guidepost of our immigration policy should be putting Americans first, not foreigners and not a tiny elite. Our immigration policy should serve the wealth and strength of our people, as Madison said in that first Congress. It should not divide our nation, impoverish our workers, and promote hyphenated Americanism. Citizenship is the most cherished thing our nation can bestow on someone. Our governing classes ought to treat it as something special. We ought to put the interests of our citizens first and welcome those foreigners best prepared to handle the duties of citizenship and contribute positively to our country. When we do, our citizens will begin to trust us once again. Thank you, God bless you, and God bless the one people of the United States.
Senator Cotton was going to rush off, but he's going to take a few questions from us this evening with his time. There are some microphones, and I really can't see you. A few questions.
Now that you know we can't see you, you don't have to be worried that I didn't see you all nodding your heads throughout my entire speech. To the extent I was going to rush off, it's because, if you don't know, we have a 2.5-year-old and a 9-month-old at home who need baths and diaper changes. When I mention this to some of the more senior and seasoned members of the Senate, like Mitch McConnell or Orrin Hatch or Chuck Grassley, they stare at me and say, "That's not the way we did it in my age." Yes, sir.
Is a possible solution to the DACA issue the beneficiaries of DACA, and perhaps in other areas as well, that they become permanent residents but not citizens with the right to vote?
So some Republicans suggest that as a source of compromise. I would prefer to see, if we're going to give legal status to these people in their 20s and 30s who came here as kids through no fault of their own, that they also have the opportunity to become American citizens. At no time in our country's history am I aware of a class of people who were permitted to live here permanently and lawfully without becoming American citizens. So I think it would be inconsistent to take that step with our political tradition. I also think it would be politically unwise, because the day that you pass a law just like that, and that is one of the compromises the Democrats give to the Republicans, is the day that the Democrats are on the west front of the Capitol denouncing the new separate but equal and the new Jim Crow. That's a simple fact. So what we should do is, if we're going to have a compromise, make sure that we mitigate the negative side effects of codifying DACA for those 700,000 recipients of that status. The first is ending chain migration, so you don't have the largest amnesty in American history through their extended families. And the second is trying to reduce the incentives that you create for more illegal immigration. I mean, think about it. If you lived in El Salvador, the most dangerous place on earth, more so than Syria, more so than Iraq, more so than Afghanistan, and the American people just gave citizenship to people who were brought here illegally as children, what would you do with your 3-year-old child, with your 2.5-year-old son and your 9-month-old son? You'd probably risk your life and their lives to make that harrowing journey to the United States. That's bad for us, it's bad for them. It is an immoral and dangerous policy, which simply says, if you survive the trip, you can stay. So we have to take additional measures to ensure that we decrease the incentives for illegal immigration. That doesn't have to be the wall. The wall is mostly a funding matter. I support the president on that, but Congress gives you every year, sometimes every 3 months, a chance to have that debate. But things like expanding the use of employment verification systems, so you not only counteract illegal immigration on our border, but also through people who lawfully enter on a visa but overstay that visa. Perhaps more agents for Customs and Border Patrol and Immigrations and Custom Enforcement. More judges for our immigration courts, so they can clear out the backlog of all the countries or all the people who are waiting for deportation. Maybe finally taking some actions against the countries who refuse to accept their citizens back on their land, even though we want to deport them. Yet they still live under the blanket of security we provide them and receive foreign aid from our government. Those are a few contours of things we could debate about, but I think from our standpoint, both to be consistent with our political traditions and also politically prudent, it would probably be unwise to create a new class of people who can live here permanently and lawfully, but without the opportunity to become citizens at some point in the future.
Senator Cotton, Sebastian Gorka, thank you for a very forceful and clearly heartfelt presentation. My time in the White House and since then, I've constantly emphasized the point you made, that it is very significant that a man who has never held public office or had a flag officer rank is now the President of the United States. Can you tell us how many of your fellow GOP colleagues understand the significance of what happened on November the 8th?
Not as many as they should, and I make this point sometimes that, you know, even if you didn't support Donald Trump in the primary, even if you didn't support him in the general election, he won, and you should reflect on the reasons that he won. As I said, I think he's more effect than cause of our present discontents. He saw a lot of things about our governing class that most people in Washington didn't see. Immigration was the most fundamental of those issues because it was a bipartisan break that he made. But on issues like trade, law and order, criminal justice, he saw things that too many people in Washington didn't see. Yet on Capitol Hill, sometimes Republicans act as if the election didn't happen. As if we don't resurrect the Gang of Eight legislation from 2013, we're going to condemn ourselves to a permanent minority status. And I asked them, like, did you see what happened in the election last year? Donald Trump won, he didn't lose. He got more Hispanic votes than Mitt Romney did in 2012. After saying some politically incorrect things about people of Latin American origin. You should think about what he appealed to among American voters of all races, of all ages, of both sexes, of all parties. Too many people in Washington, though, are still trying to adjust to what happened last year, and that's one of the reasons I think you see some of the ongoing problems we have in the Congress. All right, time for maybe one more.
Great discussion, way in the back.
Hi, thank you for being here. You mentioned the wall earlier, later in your speech, but thank you for mentioning it. Why does it continue to be pushed to the back burner? You said it's every 3 years. Why isn't the discussion now about the wall? Walls work.
No, it's every 3 months. So the wall is primarily a matter of government funding, not government policy. That means that every year when we pass the annual funding bills, that's an opportunity to try to obtain more funding for the wall. Now, the President has said they have funding for some of the preliminary steps they need, whether it's renovating current barriers like we have in California, soliciting design proposals or so forth. Just like Rome, a wall will not be built in a day. But you are very right that walls work. Physical barriers work. They worked in California to stop the flows of illegal immigration over that border. They worked in Hungary. They worked in Israel. Walls work. To say that walls don't work is to say that it's like saying fire or the wheel doesn't work. There's a reason why we have a fence around the White House. Barack Obama never took his fence down when he lived there, when he kept saying walls didn't work. Of course they were. You may oppose it. You may think it's, morally displeasing or unaesthetic, but they work. And I would say they are very needed, especially given some of the security threats we are apt to face, not just from Mexico, but from Latin America in the coming years. So the President is right that we need a wall. We need a strong, double-sided barrier that stops illegal immigrants and crime and drugs from crossing our border. Now, if it's not part of any DACA deal, as I suspect it won't be, there's going to be another government funding debate in December. It's already happening right now. It will conclude by December 8th. And that'll happen every single year. And I think the President is fully committed to making sure that we take the steps we need to secure our southern border with a physical barrier. Thank you all very much. I'll get home in time for the late night wake up of my youngest son. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for your wonderful remarks. When he first mentioned that he had to get home for bath time, I thought there's an Arkansas joke in there someplace, but I won't go there. I'll remind you that there's a continental breakfast in the Liberty Ballroom tomorrow. It starts at 7:30 a.m. And the sessions will begin in Liberty Ballroom at 9 a.m.
Matthew grew up near a prison in California, and he says it was on the outside.
I grew up in the cotton capital of the world. So thank you, Senator Arnn. Thank you, Dr. Arnn. Senator Cotton, Dr. Arnn. Thank all of you. And one last group I'd like to thank who can't be with us tonight. Please join me in thanking George Washington, James Madison, and all the founders who made this great country possible. Thank you and have a great evening.